New Jersey Supreme Court's Committee on Women in the Courts formed in 1982 and is still going strong. Chief Justice Robert Willents established it first as a task force headed by Judge Marilyn Loftus of Essex County. The committee investigates the nature and extent of systemic gender bias in the court system and makes recommendations to the Supreme Court to help ensure fair treatment for women in the courts. The committee has 4 subcommittees that develop educational programs for attorneys, judges, law schools, and one focuses on issues specific to women of color. Retired Supreme Court Justice Virginia Long.
In order to understand the effect of the Committee on Women in the Courts on the court system, you have to understand what life was like in the, quote, old days. The notion of genderism or sexism, whatever you want to call it, was so deeply ingrained not only in the judiciary but in society that people thought nothing of it. And so when we made the report in 1983 to the Judicial College, it was a bombshell. And it was a watershed not only for New Jersey but for the entire country, because every other state followed with a report like ours, including Puerto Rico. And so it changed the entire world. The idea that somebody would go into court and have a judge say, "Boy, you're good looking. Why didn't I hire you for my law clerk?" in front of the jury, it's so beyond the pale that nobody would ever expect that kind of thing to happen.
Union County Assignment Judge Karen Cassidy is the current chair of the committee.
I've only been the chair since 2012, but since then, I even see things in my past 4 to 5 years here shifting in terms of issues that morph into different issues, and that this committee can address and make the judiciary a bias-free environment. So women feel comfortable there, feel secure, feel that they're protected, that they can argue their cases, present their issues, and not be treated any differently than anybody else.
And we've done so by a series of educational programs, by a series of surveys of the legal community to essentially get a weather vane of the problems of gender unfairness, of bias, subtle bias, not so subtle bias. And we have proposed programs to the Supreme Court, have proposed action plans, and have developed a variety of ways to educate the public, the judges, the Bar Association, and law students on how to recognize bias, how to work better together, how to recognize cultural problems, and how to be more sensitive to one another and to work towards a bias-free courtroom.
We're very concerned now with kind of the intersection of gender and race to a great extent. And there's also a lot of issues now. A hot issue is called it's implicit bias. And to some extent, we all think we're aware of our biases, but a lot of times we're not. And what our committee has done in the last few years, since I've been the chair at least, is we've done a lot of educational programming on implicit bias and making people aware of things that happen that they may not even be aware of. The transgender issue, I think, is a perfect example. We may recognize somebody who comes into our court who is transgender, but yet a judge may not know how to address them. And so one of the things that we have discussed is bringing the issue up at the beginning of the proceeding in terms of how would you like me to address you? Maybe there's an issue right off the bat, and then that way we're put in a position where we're kind of giving them, empowering them a little bit, letting them know that we're sensitive to their concerns.
The court and the court system has become more inclusive than exclusive. But that's not to say that women attorneys and women of color attorneys are not facing problems with hiring problems and in the partnership track and the appointment process and parity of pay scales, and even in the perception of jurors. So therefore, I believe that our committee is as relevant now as it was when Chief Justice Willents issued the mandate in 1982 as the task force that was the predecessor of our committee. Additionally, in the current climate, we've got to be even more diligent in protecting against a court system that permits or enables people to think or act based on stereotypes, or to view women, and particularly women of color, as any less equal than their male counterparts.
It's still relevant because if you look at the most recent reports that have been made, the most recent surveys, women of color still do not believe that they have reached the place that Caucasian women have as far as equity in the courtroom. And so I think that is obviously something that needs to be drilled down on. But I also think that the committee, along with the judiciary, needs to look at the underlying difficulties that women experience just in the workplace, and to look and see what it is that we can do as judges and administrators to assist with that. In the end, women are going to still be in this sandwiched in between taking care of their parents, taking care of their children, and it falls more heavily, everybody recognizes it falls more heavily on women, and that is going to impact on them.
One of the biggest challenges is everybody thinks gender, like we've already dealt with that, done, over, we're all being treated equally, it's not an issue anymore. It is not. The New York Times ran an article talking, and it was entitled, "Bar Association Considers Striking Honeys from the Courtroom." And here we are in 2016, and a female attorney who was practicing in California had an adversary who was really talking to her in an inappropriate way. Not, sometimes would call her honey or would say things to her that, maybe you should think about staying home with your kids, or, making comments that in this day and age we are saying, why would you ever do anything like that? So obviously it's still there.
As judges, we've got to set the example. We've got to conduct ourselves professionally in the courtroom, and we've got to monitor their behavior. We've had situations, in domestic violence cases sometimes. I've had a male litigant say, well, you can't understand because you're a woman judge. No, I'm wearing this robe. I am, blind in every way. I will hear your case and I will treat you with respect. You've got to treat me with respect. And what we have to do is, as particularly as judges, not only do we have to set the example, but if we observe poor behavior in the courtroom, sexist comments, culturally insensitive comments from the attorneys towards one another or towards the witnesses, or even between the litigants, we have to speak up and say, this is not appropriate in the courtroom and we won't tolerate this.
I think that the underlying causes, the difficulties that women in the workplace are experiencing because of their home obligations, those are things that we really need to address as well.
At or about the same time I became chair, I'm also on the Access and Fairness Committee for the state. So seeing the intersection of these two committees, one of the things that I think, and again, I thought, well, I think we're doing a pretty good job, was once you saw how Access and Fairness demonstrated how people do feel sometimes that they're not treated the same as others, it really showed me that we do have to keep that education in the forefront, and that this group is critically important to bring these new types of issues out there. So I think that was a big education piece for me, that there were so many women, and there are men on this committee too, by the way, who still observe things like this happening and want to make sure that this committee is aware of it and addresses it.
My involvement in the committee has substantially enriched my professional life, my personal life. I was honored to serve as its chair for, I was trying to think about 13 years. Time flies. And I was sensitized to many subtle issues of gender bias, including racial and cultural bias, things that I didn't even think about. And by sitting around in a group and talking about a lot of the issues, even when we talked about implicit bias, and we all took this survey, this Harvard survey, and we kind of scratched our heads and said, wow, we've got implicit bias. We didn't realize that. When we met with the other judges and went through the vignettes, how you deal with each other and how would you handle this? And well, I don't know. You learn from each other. It's a tremendous learning experience.
Again, you have to go back to that era. Women were up in arms about the way that they were treated by judges and court personnel. And men, the male judges and court personnel, and men generally, did not believe for 1 second that there was any kind of differential treatment of women. And so I'm really proud of the fact that I was part of that movement, and that's what it was, which began in 1983, that I was on the panel that addressed the judiciary. And I might tell you, Chief Justice Wilentz had to threaten the judges who on their own part were threatening to boycott the report of the Committee on Women in the Courts because they were so outraged that someone would suggest that they did something other than treat women exactly the same as they treated men in the courtroom. And I believe, I look now, and it just seems to me, at least, that we have moved just mountains as far as treatment of women in the courtroom.
The Committee on Women in the Courts includes judges, attorneys, and court personnel appointed to renewable 2-year terms. It includes representatives from bar associations, private law firms, state agencies, and law schools. If you have questions about the work of the committee, you can call 609-815-2910.